Samhain, 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 is a festival that some researchers say emerged more than 3,000 years ago. Other researchers say, oh no, it existed 6,000 years ago. Today, many Wiccans, now let's just pause for a moment to remind ourselves, it's not the evil association of the past. That association of pagans, neo-pagans, and Wiccans came from fear. We no longer ascribe to a faith of fear. We recognize that there are people in the United States, across the world, that live by the cycles of the seasons, that cherish the divinity, the divine in nature, and all that exists in nature. So this earth-based tradition still, some celebrate the sacred part of Samhain, when the dead are remembered, when the dead are remembered. As we all are aware, there are other holidays around this time of year. Ironically, even their origins are related to the ancient Celtic holiday that I'm talking about today. So for now, I want to focus on what has become more of the secular occasion of Halloween. We know that there's the Day of the Dead. We know that All Saints' Day, All Souls' Day is also a part happening in the week ahead of us. All of this emerged from a recognition that our ancestors might still be with us. The autumn celebration arrived in the United States in the 1840s when there was an influx of Irish immigrants fleeing starvation and death in their homeland. Now consider this. By 1847 in Ireland, it is estimated that there were 1 million deaths due to disease and starvation from potato blight. Another 1 million people left the island. Of course, not all who departed from Ireland settled on our shores, but statistics reveal the population of Ireland was changed by at least 20 to 25% in those years. Now, regardless of the final number, that's a lot of suffering and hardship. So many of these individuals arrived here in our country carrying a bewildering mix of ancient Celtic, Roman, and Anglo-Saxon rituals, incorporating both pagan and Christian holidays. In the United States, Halloween is the second most popular holiday next to Christmas. It's a patchwork holiday, a kind of cultural Frankenstein stitched together with a number of traditions, all fused beneath the cauldron light of the American bowl of autumnal delights. Have you ever wondered why people carve pumpkins this time of year? The tradition evolved from a concept regarded as the time of the big sun and the time of the little sun. Again, as I told the children, if you've grown up here and been here all your life, it's kind of hard for us to imagine what happens if you're in an area where the snow descends, cold, frigid cold, descends, nothing grows, no more food to eat. It's so hard for us to imagine. But imagine if that was your reality. So maybe you considered, okay, it looks like we have many days of the big sun, summer, many days of the little sun, winter, when nothing grows. On the one hand, summer was the period of the great sun when light and the life force was at their strongest. Peace and plenty reigned. Winter, on the other hand, was the period of small sun and significant darkness, death, hunger, and impending chaos. In Ireland, around this time of year, Druid priests constructed a great fire. It was called a bonfire. That's the origin of the word bonfire, where they sacrifice animals, so the researchers say. Now, let me pause for a moment to explore the word sacrifice. There's a lot of negative, pejorative connotations with the word sacrifice. Oh, you know, the pagans, the Wiccans were sacrificing animals. Well, let me just pause for a minute. If you know winter is coming, if the air is getting colder, if the plants are no longer producing anything to eat, might you take time to slaughter your livestock so that you would have meat to feed your family? over the winter months. You have cold air descending that will make it so that the meat won't spoil, so you have something to eat. So I ask you, this is a human concept of self-preservation. It's not about a people being awful. It's about human preservation in a place that made it very difficult to survive. In some of my research, they regarded the bonfire as negative. However, if one were to take a practical view, you would see that people were trying to take care of themselves. Now, most researchers believe that a great fire was originally built at Claddagh, at County Meath in Ireland, that might be the original source, the sacred hill of Samhain. It was the original birthplace, some people think. This great fire raged, they built it, and it was seen for miles around. If you've been to Ireland, you know you can see for miles. There aren't many trees, and the ground is pretty much flat. So people would arrive at this bonfire or bonfire to gather pieces of that fire, to carry those sparks to light a fire in the village. So you would go to this big fire, and you would need some way to transfer the embers so you could light a big fire in your village. What might you carry that in? A turnip. Turnips were common in Ireland, not pumpkins. The pumpkin came about when they came here because pumpkins were more readily available. So they would put the ember in the turnip. If you've built a campfire, you know that fire needs a little oxygen. So what would you do? Begin carving on the turnip so oxygen could go and feed the ember. So the great fire, then the village, then people in the village would bring their turnips with tiny little cuts in it to put the ember to light the fires in their homes. It's brilliant. They were called death heads. Now, why were they called death heads? Well, let's face it, without a fire to warm a hearth, one could die. So it was critical to provide oxygen for the embers. Therefore, you would see little cuts that might look like long threads that allow the oxygen, a mouth maybe, a little hole here, a little hole there, the eyes. Consider a skull, the eyes, the nose, the mouth, death heads. We don't call them death heads. Today we call them jack-o'-lanterns, right? About the term Halloween, perhaps you've heard of All Hallows Eve, and as my formerly Catholic spouse said, Holy Eve. I think it's hallowed Sacred Eve. Holy Eve, he said. So call it what you will. It meant summer's end. It was the end of the harvest season, meaning summer is over. And then it carried that evening of this celebration, carried the name Halloween. Researchers point out that through time, Christian leaders tried to influence the pagans. For example, in 601 CE, Pope Gregory I issued an edict to his missionaries about the belief and the habits of the people he wanted to convert. He realized that it would be almost impossible to obliterate native beliefs completely, and so he suggested to his priests that they Christianize the people as whenever possible. So this was 601 CE. Gregory III identified November the 1st, All Saints' Day, and November the 2nd, All Souls' Day. On Saints' Day, you dress up like the saints and recall the ancestors. So what were they doing in our Samhain celebrations? Dressing up to scare away the spirits that they don't want at their house and putting out treats for the spirits that they wanted to have in their village. So November 1st, All Saints' Day. On November 2nd, All Souls' Day, where you, the living, could provide prayers in hopes that your ancestors could go on to heaven should they be in purgatory. While previous church leaders had tried to discourage Samhain's traditions, such as wearing the frightening costumes, Gregory III took a more practical approach and encouraged people to dress up in honor of the saints. Now, other traditions, such as begging for food or kindling, were legitimized by the church. They said you could do this, you could provide food for the poor, but you couldn't do it to appease the spirits the otherworldly spirits. On November 2nd, the church encouraged people to light candles dedicated to those souls in purgatory. It was believed that lighting candles and saying prayers for the dead would shorten the length of the time they were expected to suffer. So in both cases, we're all reflecting on our ancestors. This practice is very similar to the ancient Samhain rituals, whereby it was thought that the veil between life and death became very thin. Why wouldn't you think this way if you watched your plants die and the whole terrain become barren and appear like death? Why didn't you think, oh, that happens to people? But right now, we're right at the veil when it's the thinnest, and maybe my prayers can be heard and my ancestors will know that I'm here. So fires were lit to help souls or spirits move out of the homes from which they formerly lived and to find their way to the summer lands. That was another thing. Go to where the great sun is so that you won't have to suffer and fear death anymore. Do you all remember playing games at Halloween parties? This harkens back to the games played in the early days of Halloween, when Hallows Eve or Halloween was thought to be a night of supernatural activities. Fortune telling was prominent. You wanted to know who your daughter was going to marry? Go to a fortune teller that night. Through rituals that appear as games today, the living would try to communicate with the dead to find out the future. Let's look at some of those activities. Now, the Romans brought their pagan mythology and celebration to Britain, including a November 1st harvest festival of Pomona. Pomona was the goddess of the orchard. Pomona celebrated the apple. No doubt it fostered the prominence of apple bobbing. So we don't do that anymore, right? Like, oh my gosh, even today I'm appalled that we shared each other's slobbers in an apple bobbing contest. But people would watch how the young people would bob for the apple. One might delicately chase the apple on the top of the water. That would imply how one would find a mate. The other one dive in deep and dig their teeth in the apple. So it was talking about parents and people were trying to find out about the future. Research from Scotland revealed that young people were blindfolded and sent to a garden to pull up kale stalks. So the garden is dead, the kale stalk's there, and the child is blindfolded. Go pull up a kale stalk. If you pulled up a kale stalk and there were lots of roots, you were going to marry somebody who had lots of wealth and supplies to support you. If you pulled up a kale stalk and there weren't many roots, we're so sorry for you. There was a tradition from Wales that today appears sort of morbid, although it was common back in the day when death was very common for all ages. On Halloween, family members, it is said, would write their initials on white stones and throw them into the hearth fire. One was told to pray and go to bed, and in the morning, those who could not locate their own stone in the ashes would die within the year. How morbid is that? And the more I thought about this, I thought, if white stones were thrown into a fire, wouldn't they all be black the next day? That's not a good way to wake up. How about the prevalence of witches in Halloween? In many Wiccan and neo-pagan circles, witches were, and to this day, are revered. These women are priestesses, herbalists, midwives, and knowledgeable individuals who were and often are considered very threatening beings in our society. In a society steeped in religions whereby patriarchy is sustained by oppressive practices. Oppressive practices like a woman cannot speak from the pulpit. Only a man can do that. We're not so far. I'll stop there. In the early Middle Ages, the Christian church fostered a profound distrust of women, in particular of female sexuality, which was considered to be a corrupting influence. These widespread fears contributed to the witch-hunting crazes that spread across Europe. While both men and women were accused of witchcraft, most people thought of witches as malicious women who, having made a pact with the devil, worked magic at night to allow them to fly. Oh, I wish I could fly. To change shape and to control the weather. Have you ever wondered where black cats came into play? Oh, those were witches who changed into black cats. So witches were said to be able to change into one form or the other. How about vampires? Well, 18th century, a new horror, the vampire entered the British catalogue of monsters. While vampire myths date back at least 1,000 years and occur all over the world, little was known of them in Britain until a series of highly publicized Serbian vampire trials, which took place between 1721 and 1734. Most of the trial accounts shared the same basic elements: the return of the vampire from the dead, it's preying on human flesh at night, it's drinking blood, and all of that stuff associated with vampires. So in the Irish tradition, the spirits of Halloween included more than the souls of the departed. There were others, including fairy beings. Here's an 1896 seasonal little ditty. By the way, kobold is a gnome-like creature. Pixie, kobold, elf, and sprite are all on the rounds tonight. In the wane or wan moon's silver ray thrives their helter-skelter play. In this way, helter-skelter was not Charles Manson's murderous definition, but the earlier definition of the term, which implied to create chaos and disorder. Helter-skelter referred to the chaotic pranks of the fairy folk who were said to even still babies and place a changeling in their place. Okay, so you think this is too wild. If any of you have had children and been around babies, at 1 minute, aren't they darling and sweet? And the next minute, wah! You're like, who made this monster? Who made this monster? So I see where that one came, a changeling. Do any of you recall soaping windows or throwing toilet paper? Yeah, over trees. Now you don't want to do that because there are cameras, right? Maybe you participated in other forms of mischief making. You would have been identifying with the ancestors for sure. Halloween was the one night when people could get away with chaotic activities, normally not acceptable at other times. You can say, the devil made me do it. Researcher David Scull said children used to go to the shops. Now, this is where trick-or-treat came in. So children would go to the shops. The parents would give them a list, and they would go to the shopkeepers. And through time, they knew the shopkeepers well and were therefore in an excellent position to demand a handout in exchange for continued patronage. Uncooperating vendors were rewarded by terrific and repeated bangings on the doors. This was in the 1900s. Youngsters would bang on the gates of fences, windows, and doors of private residencies. So shopkeepers and families began giving treats to children who arrived at their door. And the begging practice by ragamuffins was common in the streets, especially before the Depression. However, newspaper reports out of New York City show that there were tricks aplenty against private property and public safety. It was partly because of economic disparity. There would be displays such as overturning a vehicle, breaking or soaping windows. Doris Hudson Moss, writing for the American Home magazine in 1939, wrote about her success. She said, I began decorating my house, opening my doors, and if the decorations were spooky enough and I provided enough food and hearty sustenance, you can be sure that the little rowdies from the other side of the town will join in the party spirit and leave your front gate intact. So I'm going to close with this interesting fact. We all know the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade, right? So there were these quiet men's clubs that the men would dress up and have parades. Well, they decided to encourage the children and families to dress up and join the other men's clubs to have a big parade. And they wanted to try to encourage not so many Halloween antics, but have it come at the Macy's. Later became Macy's Parade. But early on, it was a parade of costumes for children and families. So in recognition of our Unitarian Universalist living tradition that shares from many sources, including spiritual teachings of earth-centered traditions, which celebrate the sacred cycle of life and instructs us to live in harmony with the rhythms of nature, thankful for the many reasons to celebrate, especially in times of weariness and woes. May we today recognize our good fortune to exist in times of mostly plenty that affords us the opportunity to laugh and to play. Blessed be. May it be so.